Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Adult Sunday School for November the 15th, 2020 in the Goldendale Church of the Nazarene. It's good to be here with you again today. We're getting through the 10 Commandments. Today we're going to be we're almost done. We're going to be looking at the 9th commandment. So let's go ahead, put me in the corner as we do, and we will begin. The title of today's lesson is As Good as Our Word. And you will find the lesson, if you have your lesson book, it's on pages 44 through 47. And as always, I strongly encourage you to go through that material because I will not be going through it in detail. I'm just going to be hitting on a few observations and points along the way. And the first, as we've gotten used to doing, we're going to just do a quick review of where we've been so far with the 10 Commandments. The first commandment about loving God above all other gods is God letting us know basically that it's about relationship. He wants to have a relationship with his people. And the second commandment against idols, God is telling us that the good is the enemy of the best, that he is the best, and that any other thing or person or interest or whatever is not the best. It may be good, but it's not the best. The third commandment, basically saying don't take God's name in vain. We all do this, of course, but as the whole Bible tells us, God is really more inclined to restore us to relationship with him, not to destroy us. That's not where his priority is. So we'd have to work pretty hard to get ourselves destroyed, but as I say, its heart is for restoration. The fourth commandment is the Sabbath, and this one we see very clearly, starting even in creation. God has set up the pattern of work and rest, and he wants us to rest. He's ordained it, so rest is good. We shouldn't feel guilty about taking our time of rest. And then the fifth commandment, same thing with parents and children. The commandment is to honor your parents. God has established the parent-child relationship as a pattern, right? As he so often does. It's a pattern for our relationship with him. He is our Father and we are his children. And just as we should honor our earthly parents, we certainly should honor God. And then for the sixth commandment, prohibiting murder, we're created in God's image, so we are uniquely precious to God, and he does not want to see those who are made in his image murdered. The seventh commandment has to do with adultery, and one of the things that I thought was important that came out of this is just realizing that in breaking one commandment, we often, or maybe always, end up breaking others, right? We talked about adultery as a sin in itself, but also involving other sins, such as covetousness, lying. I mean, there are a number of them that are covered in this one misstep that we might make. And then last week we talked about the eighth commandment, which was against theft, right? And there were specific guidelines and rules in the Old Testament about how to make restitution for theft, that you were either to return the item that you stole or the value of the item if it wasn't possible to return the actual item. But also God's heart is not just for restitution of the items or the things that were stolen, but restoration of the relationship, right? Because trust breaks down when there's thievery going on, and you want a restored relationship. And God is all about restoring relationships, even when it may seem hopeless. So let's go ahead now. We're on the 9th commandment, which you can find in Exodus 20, verse 16. And I am going to be using the Amplified version of the Bible this time around. The Amplified version is really interesting because what it does is it gives you all the nuances of a word that is translated one way, but there might be more additional meaning or amplifications, which is why it's called the Amplified Bible, because it amplifies the meaning of the term that's being translated. So this verse is translated, "You shall not testify falsely, that is, lie, withhold, or manipulate the truth against your neighbor, and your neighbor, of course, is any person. So let's look at that a little bit. And first thing we want to see is, what is the definition of oath? Because this is, again, not a word that many of us are familiar with. So we go to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and there are a few things here that are interesting for us to look at. The first definition: a solemn, usually formal, calling upon God or a god to witness the truth of what one says, or to witness that one sincerely intends to do what one says. And then related to that, number 2 there, a solemn attestation of the truth or inviolability of one's words. So we see clearly here that the oath carries some legal sense, and also, well, you hear so often people say things like, "Oh, I swear to God," which, that is a whole nother problem. We'll cover that in a minute. But when we make an oath, and certainly any oath that invokes God's name, we're putting him on the line. We're basically saying, if we don't keep our word, it reflects on God, because we've called on God to support our truthfulness and our trustworthiness. So let's just hold that thought, and maybe we'll explore that a little bit more here in a minute. The other thing we can look at here is this B here that talks about something such as a promise that's corroborated by an oath. So in other words, something that is supported by an oath. So if you take an oath of office, you are essentially saying that you are going to be fulfilling this office. And then here's the interesting thing, is that oath can also mean, in English anyway, it can mean exactly the opposite of everything we were just talking about. It can mean basically a swear word or a careless use of a sacred name. Remember the third commandment, that you shall not take God's name in vain or use it carelessly or trivialize it in any way. If you do that, that's also called an oath in English. And here's an example. He uttered an oath and stormed away. You may see that in writing more than you ever see it in speech. That's not really something we often say. Now, we've looked at what the commandment is in the Old Testament, but let's jump ahead to what Jesus has to say, because I think that brings it into the realm of where Christians might say, oh, this is how Jesus views this commandment and how we need to make sure that we are adhering to it. So in Matthew chapter 5, verses 34 through 37, again, the Amplified Version, we read the following: "But I say to you, do not make an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you are not able to make a single hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no." In other words, a firm yes or no. "Anything more than that comes from the evil one." So in other words, don't invoke God's name to support your promises or your account of something. This is really what happened. I swear to God, this is really what happened. Don't bring God into it. You should be able to have a reputation that is such that when you say this happened or it didn't happen, or yes, I will do this or no, I won't, that your word is good enough. Remember, those of you who are old enough, remember there used to be a saying, his word is his bond. In other words, he could be trusted just on his own word. He didn't need a signed contract or anything. If he said he was going to do it, it would get done. I don't know that we use that so often anymore, and there's certainly a lot less trust in the world than there used to be. But what Jesus is saying is, let's get back to that, and you don't need to bring God into it and put him on the line and risk his reputation just for your getting getting your account accepted or your promise believed in, whatever. But what I wanted to point out to you was something that is something I think I said a few lessons back, that these commandments, rather than just being little standalone things that don't relate to one another, they are actually very linked with one another. And just as the commandment not to steal is linked to the commandment not to covet, as we talked about when we talked about stealing, let's see, this commandment, the one we're looking at now, the commandment not to bear false witness, is linked to the commandment against taking God's name in vain. And I think you see that from what I was just discussing, that we don't want to take God's name in vain. That's commandment number 3. Bearing false witness puts God on the hook for us to be telling the truth. And why are we doing that? We're risking a lot more than God looking bad. We're risking our eternal security in God if we're not careful, because we don't treat him as the one that we love above all others, and that we don't want to bring into disrepute. We are considering his name precious. We're treating it that way, and we would not do anything to bring his great power into question. So when I wanted to give you a little bonus today, and this is a question that comes up a lot among Christians. I found this article. It just so happened I got this in my email, in my inbox this morning. And I thought, well, this is actually very timely because it ties to this particular commandment. And I thought we could just read through this together as just my little bonus gift to you for the day. And it's, what is the unforgivable sin? And the man who wrote this, Dr. Nicholas Schlosser, he belongs to an organization where they are basically Messianic Christians, so they're Jewish Christians who give us kind of the Jewish background of what's in the Bible, both New and Old Testaments, and give us just kind of a little more insight into some of the things that we might not understand or know without a little help. So I'm just going to read excerpts from this article for you, just so you can get an idea of what the Jewish point of view is in this commandment that we are just talking about. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 31 and 32, Jesus declares, "Every sin and blasphemy will be forgiven people, but the blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven. Whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either in this world or in the world to come." And I know that gets a lot of people concerned. Have I perhaps broken that and not even realized it? Have I committed the sin against the Holy Spirit, and am I doomed? Well, this I think will give you some insight and maybe bring comfort to you. As Dr. Schlosser says, the immediately preceding discussion between Yeshua and the Pharisees, Yeshua is Jesus' name in Hebrew, by the way. So whenever you see Yeshua, which actually can also be translated Joshua, that's Jesus. So the discussion between Yeshua and the Pharisees that comes before the quote that I just read shows that the unforgivable sin is attributing the work of the Holy Spirit to the work of Satan. Immediately after, the Pharisees misidentified the power behind Jesus' work, because you may remember he was doing miracles, and the Pharisees were saying he does these miracles in the name of Beelzebub, who is a pagan god, basically, that Jesus equates with Satan. So the Pharisees have accused Jesus of performing miracles in Satan's name, basically. The Messiah mentions blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. In light of this context, readers can know that to speak against the Holy Spirit is to attribute an act of the Spirit to Satan. Therefore, in order for someone to commit the unforgivable sin, that person would need to see or hear about a miraculous act of God and reject it as the devil's doing. Blasphemy against the Holy Spirit isn't just any old error that one might commit unwittingly. Rather, the unforgivable sin is a deliberate declaration that identifies divine activity as a diabolic endeavor. And you can understand why that would really be an affront to God. I mean, talk about taking God's name in vain. That is definitely cutting right to the heart of it. The takeaway from this passage is, on the one hand, that Christians might think twice about rushing to label another self-identified Christian ministry or movement as demonic. If the indictment is incorrect, it could lead to an interminable iniquity. So in other words, if we as Christians see other Christians doing certain things and we say, well, that's not Christian, that's of the devil. Well, if we're wrong about that, we've done exactly what Jesus is talking about. We've committed the unforgivable sin. We've attributed a miracle of God to the work of Satan, and we need to be really, really careful not to do that. This is why Jesus follows his exposition of the unforgivable sin by saying that people will give account for every careless word they speak, and that's Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. On the other hand, as long as believers are not in the habit of slandering their fellow Christians as satanic, they can know that they have not perpetrated, I guess is the word, this unpardonable offense. To be sure, the New Testament says to test the spirits to see whether they are from God, for many false prophets have gone out into the world, and that's 1 John 4:1. But testing spirits in order to avoid false teaching need not include accusations of devilish dealings. And I think that's important to know. He's not saying here that you can't question the things that you see other Christians doing. But it's a difference between questioning, investigating, looking into it, and accusing, right? Yes, you don't want to be judge and jury on something that you don't understand. Jesus advises that in order to avoid swearing an oath falsely, one should not swear at all. See Matthew chapter 5, 33 and 34, which we looked at just a little while ago. A similar principle applies in the case of the unforgivable sin. In order to ensure no slander against the Spirit, don't slander at all. Well, I think that's actually pretty good advice. And remember, my mother used to say, if you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything at all. And I think that's actually a good rule for living, don't you? A lot of those rules we learned in childhood, we probably ought to pick them up and make sure we're still following them, because they are very good and very important. Well, this was a real quick run through, but I think by now you're getting the idea that a lot of what these commandments is all about, not just a list of rules to follow, but a way of God expressing his heart of love for us, his care and concern, and just that strong relationship both with him and with each other. And so I think we're done for the day. I'm going to let you go, but thanks for biding your time here with me this morning. And I will see you again next week, but in the meantime, have a blessed day and a blessed week.